If you hang out with anybody long enough, you start to hear stories more than once, and that can get particularly confusing when what you're actually hearing is two separate stories that have a lot of the same details. For example, there were two different girls that I briefly dated in high school, and at two different times in the winter, we went up into the mountains and went bouldering with some friends on an unseasonably warm day in the winter. And it was just a beautiful, lovely time. Nothing too crazy happened. We went up. We happened to eat at the same restaurant in Estes Park both times with our friends. And we had a really nice time in the mountains. They were just very, very similar, very, very memorable days. But not all of the details align, like what car we were driving, who the other friends were we were up there with. And so as a result, if you heard me tell both of those stories, you might think like, oh, wait a minute, there's some kind of conflict here in the versions, when in reality, no, it just happened two separate times. Also, though, I forget things. So you could hang out with me long enough and I could tell you a story and be like, I'm pretty sure that's what happened. And then later on, time goes by and you forget some stuff, or maybe some other story informs how you remember that story, and then you tell it and somebody's like, hey, wait a minute. There were differences between those two stories, but it sounded like the same thing. And then you stop and you think about it and you're like, oh, yeah, that only happened one time that we went and did that thing, and I just got the details wrong on a couple of points on that second story. Likewise, we've got a situation like that brewing here in Matthew 26, and I think it's important as we're sorting through this little story about the anointing of Jesus at Bethany by some woman, to step aside briefly from the narrative and try to figure out whether we're hearing a story that comes up somewhere else in the Bible, but the details seem a little bit different, or whether we're hearing a separate story from something that comes up somewhere else in the Bible, and it just happens to look really similar in a lot of ways. Here's what I mean. In Matthew chapter 26, we are quite a ways into the Passion Week already. It's like midweek here, I guess. And then it says in verse 6 that Jesus was in Bethany at the home of a man known as Simon the leper. And then a woman comes in with an alabaster jar full of super expensive perfume, and she's like, dumps the whole thing on his head. Like, boom, there's all of it. There's everything I've got. And it's this beautiful moment, but the disciples' knee-jerk reaction, because of their very important piety, is to be like, what the heck? No, you can't be doing that stuff. And they freak out on her and talk about how they could have sold that and used it to help out the poor. And then Jesus responds, we've looked at half of his response so far. Why are you bothering this woman? She's done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you'll always have with you, but you'll not always have me. Now, based on Matthew's account, we don't know who this lady is. We don't know what her name is, but we do know that Jesus had some connections in Bethany. The sisters Mary and Martha lived there. They come up in Luke and in other places. But if we flip over to John 11? No, 11. Oh, duh. Yeah, 11 is where Lazarus gets healed. And Lazarus is the brother of Mary and Martha. So that healing would have happened in Bethany as well. And then some time passes, according to John, after the resurrection of Lazarus. And that seems to be an event that gets people even more worked up, because now people want to follow Jesus even more because, he just got somebody to come back from the grave, and that's exciting to people apparently. And so the Pharisees are turning up the heat. Jesus goes and lays low for a while in John's account. And then it says in John 11:55, when it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, many went up from the country to Jerusalem for their ceremonial cleansing before the Passover. They kept looking for Jesus as they stood in the temple area. They asked one another, what do you think? Isn't he coming to the feast at all? But the chief priests and Pharisees had given orders that if anyone found out where Jesus was, he should report it so that they might arrest him. Sounds, again, a lot like the account of the wise men and Herod early on. The chief priests, they're acting like Herod. That's not super flattering. But then we get into John 12, and now we get in a story that sounds a lot like the one we're looking at over in Matthew. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus arrived at Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of the disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. John would know. He was part of this team, and he saw what Judas was doing. Leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. And then after a few more sentences, John goes on to say in John 12:12, the next day, the great crowd that had come for the feast heard that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. They took palm branches and went out to meet him. So on its surface, it looks like we're talking about the exact same story here, and maybe we are. But the timeline that Matthew seems to give us looks different than the timeline that John seems to give us. In John, we're still 6 days before the Passover when Jesus goes to Bethany. There's a dinner given in his honor. All of that stuff lines up. Martha and Mary are there. Mary pours out this expensive perfume. Sounds like we're talking about the same exact event. Judas Iscariot objects. Well, that sounds credible, like he'd be the one to speak up there. That lines up with Matthew. Jesus replies with language that sounds pretty much identical to what Matthew has him saying. But then it gets tricky because then the triumphal entry happens, whereas in Matthew, well, the triumphal entry was like 5 chapters ago. That's in 21. That's way back there. So are we talking about 2 separate stories or the same story? I don't know. Let's go back on to Matthew 26, see if there's any wiggle room in the timeline over here. All right, Matthew 26, when Jesus had finished saying all of these things. So that's after the Olivet Discourse that we spent so much time looking at. He says to his disciples, Passover is 2 days away. Okay, so there's a timeline marker. Then it says, then the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and they plotted to arrest Jesus in some sly way and kill him, but not during the feast, they said, or there may be a riot among the people. Okay, that seems to line up with what's being said at the end of John chapter 11, and that comes before the account of this meal. And then we get into verse 6, which is the story we're looking at, and it says, while Jesus was in Bethany, Well, I guess it doesn't specifically say, then, right after that, Jesus went back to Bethany. So maybe we're still talking about the time in Bethany from all the way back here in chapter 21, or even before chapter 21. All of the gospel writers, to at least some extent, seem to be cool with telling the story a little bit out of order here and there, to gather ideas together, to move the themes and the narrative forward. Indeed, a whole bunch of authors in the Old Testament, we talked at length about how Daniel did this in his document, will also use achronological storytelling to gather ideas as opposed to just bullet pointing a story in order. Indeed, ancient historians outside the Bible used this technique. This was a very accepted technique for this kind of writing. So, since Matthew does not give us a definitive timeline here, but rather just says, while Jesus was in Bethany, we could be jumping back here. Like if I told you a whole story about me going to college in Chicago and moving out there from the Front Range of Colorado, and I'm telling you about my first semester and things happening in Chicago. And then I said, while I was in Fort Collins, I went to a restaurant and I met a guy and I told him, like, that works narratively. That doesn't feel like I've pulled one over on you. You would just know intuitively, oh, he's back in Fort Collins for that part. He said while he was in Fort Collins, so he was back in northern Colorado. I get it. Here, maybe because of some cultural barriers, it seems a little bit more ambiguous than that. But a lot of smart people seem to think that we're talking about the same exact event here, and that Matthew and John just have them organized a little bit differently because of how closely the details correspond. Now, Mark gives us an account in chapter 14 that's structured just exactly like Matthew's. The Passover, the feast is coming up. The chief priests make the plan to kill him, but not during the feast. And then the same exact language gets used. While he was in Bethany, reclining at the table of the home of a man known as Simon the leper. Again, we don't get any new information here. A woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, and boom, the whole thing plays out pretty much verbatim. Mark is maybe telling the story a little bit of out of order as we would think of order as being as well. And then Luke is kind of the wild card, because in Luke, there's an account that kind of sounds like this. Early on, I thought it was in chapter 6. I do not see it in chapter 6. I am turning the page. It is in chapter 7. There we go. My bad. In Luke chapter 7, we've been in Capernaum. We've been over closer to Nazareth, but nowhere near Jerusalem. We are way, way up north, and we get an account that has similar features, but looks to be distinct from what we're getting in Matthew, John, and Mark. In this one, the Pharisees invite Jesus to have dinner with him, so he goes to a Pharisee's house. It's not Simon the leper. And a woman who had, quote, lived a sinful life in that town learned that Jesus was eating there, and she goes over there, and she brings an alabaster jar of perfume, and she stands behind him, and she's weeping, and she starts to wet his feet with her tears, and then she wipes them with her hair and kissed them and poured perfume all over them. And the Pharisee doesn't object to the expense, unsurprisingly. Instead, the Pharisee objects to the dirtiness and uncleanness of this dirty, dirty woman who had lived a, quote, sinful life in that town. And then Jesus tells a little micro parable about somebody who got forgiven a lot versus somebody who got forgiven a little, and points to the beauty of this moment and what this lady is doing. There are enough distinctions here that I think what we've got going is two separate incidents. One in Bethany, right as Jesus is getting into Jerusalem and fixing to be arrested, and that involves Mary, Martha, Lazarus, and apparently takes place in the home of some mysterious guy named Simon the leper. Then we've got another incident that may have inspired Mary to anoint Jesus with that expensive perfume and just dump the whole thing out in Matthew, Mark, and John. And what I'm trying to say is that maybe she was inspired to do so by the story of what this mystery woman, sometimes considered to be Mary Magdalene in Luke 7, who dumped out perfume and wept and wiped Jesus' feet with her hair and kissed his feet. If it is Mary Magdalene, then those two Marys knew each other, talked. Mary knew that Jesus responded favorably to this. Maybe this isn't Mary Magdalene. There's debate about that as well. But all of that aside, if we're talking about a separate Mary in the house of Mary and Martha, maybe she heard this story and was like, yeah, I want to pour out value on Jesus as well, because I think that was a great way to express exactly how I feel about him. So the fact that there's overlap between these two stories, to me, just helps us get more richness and depth and understanding in terms of what was actually going on here and what was being felt. And it really confirms just how tacky and awful the disciples come off as looking in response to this. Well, we're not done with the story. We got to break down the rest of Jesus' response. I just decided that today we were going to go and do that little comparative thing, and I had a lovely time, and I hope you did as well. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.